we need really leadership from the top, which means a consistent, ambitious political target setting and implementing the right policy to really provide the foundation, for instance, for investor confidence, to really drive the energy transition confidence.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. My name is Manuel Köhler. I'm the Managing Director of Aurora's Berlin office. And today's discussion is going to be awesome. I'll be speaking with the Managing Director of BayWa Renewables Wind. BayWa is one of the largest renewables developers in Europe with projects all around the world. She was formerly Energy Sector Manager at the Fraunhofer Society, and before that has been the Managing Director of another big wind developer, Juwi. My guest on the show today is Marie-Luise Pörtner. Welcome, Marie-Luise.
Welcome, Manuel. Thanks a lot
Great.
for having me.
Absolutely pleased to have you here. So let's maybe start with a bit of your background, your journey, basically. And given it's a broader audience on this podcast, could you perhaps explain what does BayWa do?
Well, if we talk about BayWa, we have to distinguish between the BayWa r.e. group, which is RE stands for Renewable Energies, and our mother company, which is BayWa AG, which was actually founded almost 100 years ago in 1923 as an agricultural cooperative. Some people always ask, what does BayWa stand for? It actually stands for Bayerische Warenvermittlung landwirtschaftlicher Genossenschaften, a very long and old-fashioned German name. And in 2009, BayWa AG acquired a development company called Renewable, which was the start of BayWa r.e. In the meantime, as you said, the BayWa r.e. has grown a lot. It has 2,400, I believe, employees around the globe with business activities in almost 30 countries. And the structure is that we have like three main business segments in BayWa r.e. First is the project development, so mainly solar and wind onshore, but also offshore. Second, we have what we call operations, which comprises our service business, so technical and commercial management, energy trading, and our IPP entity. And third, we have a segment called energy solutions, which is also the most recent one, where we focus on tailor-made corporate energy solutions.
That's very interesting. And I mean, we touched on it in the beginning, basically. You held a number of senior positions in the energy sector. What made you stick with the sector, with the energy industry?
I should maybe start with what made me join the energy industry, as my professional life started in completely different areas, such as TV and IT industry. But then in 1990, I started to study political science with a focus on international politics. And at that time, scientists knew probably everything they know today about climate change, but it was not at all on the international agenda. I mean, remember that COP3 in Kyoto was the first climate conference where there were any binding targets at all. But that was only in 1997, and the Kyoto Protocol became effective only in 2005. But in 1990, there was the invasion of Iraq in Kuwait, which resulted in the so-called First Gulf War, and successively in many other conflicts in the Middle East until today. And these conflicts were all clearly related to oil and gas or to access to fossil energies. So for me, renewable energies, besides being carbon-free, climate-friendly source of energy, have always had these other dimensions as well, such as really peace, global climate justice, and a development perspective also for poor countries. So I really actively searched for a possibility to work in this sector, which came by chance when Juwi organized an open house day. And I just took the opportunity to talk to one of the two founders. And that's where the whole thing started.
That's very interesting. Okay.
So maybe, but coming back to your question, what made me stick to it? And I found, and I still find it really fascinating, how renewables develop from a niche and an idea of eco freaks to something really big and on a global scale. And it really makes me happy, although I'm always frustrated by the slowness of political decisions and the required changes in the legal framework. But we definitely left this first phase of the energy transition now, where it was really mainly about increasing the renewable capacities. And now we are in this challenging phase of integrating everything, all sectors, and of cracking the really hard nuts. And that's what I think is really challenging.
And it's really exciting to hear about your journey. And maybe if we dive a little bit in your current role. So can you explain why you took the role that you currently have within BayWa, and how important is the German wind development division to the group?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I left Juwi again after almost 8 years, I first thought I would like to have a broader view on the overall energy system and topic, and what has to be done regarding research and innovations. So that's why I joined Fraunhofer at that time, which was a really interesting task. But I also felt rather quickly that this is all a bit too theoretical for me, and that I really love to directly work on projects and real wind farms. So it was then that I took the role of managing director at BayWa r.e., because at that time the company had grown very quickly, and there was a need to introduce a structure and new processes. And for me, this is also always a chance and an opportunity to structure it in a way I think is best. And there was also rather few experience at that time with greenfield development, so really developing from scratch. And I was always convinced that this is the most attractive business model. Mm-hmm. So it was a great opportunity for me to focus on greenfield and to start growing a really impressive project pipeline as of today.
Absolutely, and I think we talk much more about the industry and your plans ahead. But let me perhaps slightly change the subject. So I personally think we still have way too few women in senior positions in the energy industry. And as you said, you started your career about 2 decades ago. Do you think the industry is changing in that aspect?
How much time have we for this podcast? That's a big issue. No, I think compared to maybe
much time as you need, I guess.
Compared to 15 or 20 years ago, I would say things have changed. I'm always joking, because my empirical observation is always whether you have to queue in front of the women's bathroom when you're at energy conferences or not, to see where the percentage is. But seriously, of course, we are not where we should be, and that's not only related to gender. It's maybe the most striking topic, but it's about diversity in general, really. Because I think the question is really, how can we have a true representation of our multifaceted and diverse society in this industry and in each company? Because this is the society is where we live in, and we should make sure that all these different perspectives, backgrounds, genders, whatever, are represented in a good way. And for me, really the key is to achieve that is creating an environment and a culture in a company that is really inclusive. So where everyone really feels accepted and free to say whatever he or she thinks or feels, without being looked at strangely somehow. Let's take the example of like women being considered too emotional sometimes in how they react. But assume that's true. I don't even know, but why should this be bad? The climate crisis we're in is something everybody should be very emotional about, and I'm rather suspicious if someone is not.
Yeah, that's really, really, really interesting, and certainly something we also face as a challenge. Although, my perspective is, and this is not what this podcast is about, it is getting a bit better, but it's still a challenge. I'm really excited to see that.
Interestingly, this COVID-19 thing and remote working may actually help to create a more inclusive culture, I believe. For instance, I heard people say that if you are in a Zoom or a Teams meeting, even the alpha males that usually dominate physical meetings just by the way they enter the room. They are just tiny little boxes on the screen as well, the same size than yours, and it's kind of levels out certain things.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's a good point. Let's see. Hope that some of that lasts. Great. Let's maybe move on to the energy sector, and of course that's the big background topic here for our discussion today. I understand you are working at BayWa at a white paper on the challenges over the next decade. And I was really interested, why do you think the next 10 years in particular will be crucial for the energy sector, and what needs to happen?
Well, I mean, we have lost so much time in the past decades, and I clearly count myself to the generation that messed it up somehow. So if we want to have the slightest chance, and that's my full conviction, to stop or at least to limit climate change to a somehow bearable level, then we need much more progress and at a much greater pace. So I don't know if you know the UN emissions gap report that was issued in 2019. It comes to the conclusion that we have just a really very small window left within which we must radically reduce our global emissions. And this window closes around 2030. And that's why we have named also this white paper the decade that matters, because that's the decade in which we have to pick up significant speed in decarbonizing the whole economy. And coming back to COVID, these really staggering sums of money being invested now by governments worldwide to support their economies, they could actually be a huge opportunity if this global stimulus package becomes a really green transition stimulus package. So yeah, and we, in this paper, we just try to describe what exactly needs to be done and what are the key factors and drivers needed to propel this renewable transition forward at the pace required.
I fully agree. I mean, daunting numbers. If you look at the rate of emission decline that needs to happen, it's basically what we have achieved during this year with COVID and all the lockdowns. So that's certainly a big challenge for the next decade. But what do you think needs to happen? What are the main areas you identify there at your work on the paper that you're working on?
I think it's really hard to boil that down because, of course, the whole energy system and the whole climate topic is so complex. But I think first and foremost, we need really, and that also sounds a bit trivial, but we need really leadership from the top, which means a consistent, ambitious political target setting and implementing the right policy to really provide the foundation, for instance, for investor confidence, to really drive the energy transition confidence. And then, of course, when you go more in the details, this means, first of all, a really massive increase in the deployment of renewables and a more proactive move away from fossil fuels, not only waiting until they paid off. It's cost competitiveness is a huge topic, cost competitiveness of renewables and reaching really a global grid parity. It's a lot of investment and a lot of innovation with regard to infrastructure, digitization, hybrid projects, storage, everything you can think of. And then it's, of course, the coupling of the sectors, which is the electrification and the decarbonization of the transport sector mainly, and also a strong focus on the industry, especially the energy intensive industries.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a broad range of topics. And I'd probably be interested to pick one of these. I mean, you mentioned renewables cost competitiveness as an important factor. PPAs probably has been the buzzword over the last 3-4 years, but you also actively working on that. I mean, many will know that you recently announced a number of PPA-based solar projects in Germany and Spain, for example, currently ramp up your offering for post-subsidy wind projects. How do you see the industry adapting to renewables, taking on more and more merchant risks? Are you already seeing standards emerging in the PPA market, or is it still a very individualized case-by-case negotiation?
Well, first of all, I think this adapting is really the natural evolution that comes with the expansion of renewables. And as you said, also in the light of fading or less favorable support schemes available. But I think the increasing appetite of utilities and corporates also for renewables provides a good opportunity to also pass certain part of this market risk to these parties, exactly by signing PPAs. And there are really various PPA price structures available in the market which facilitate this risk allocation between buyer and seller under a PPA. If you ask about standards, I think that's very hard to say because it's such a fast and also dynamic development in the PPA market. And of course, the structure of a PPA depends very much on, first of all, which market are you talking about? Are we talking about a utility for which a PPA is basically their core business, or is it a corporate that usually does not deal with energy? How capable are these players to negotiate PPAs? How is their internal decision making? How risk friendly or averse are they? How big is competition? Is it rather a buyer's or a seller's market? So all these factors, of course, influence how you structure a PPA. Nevertheless, I think we can say that we see the market converging to somehow 10-year fixed price PPAs in the last 12 months, maybe, which is, I guess, also a consequence of the increase of corporate PPAs because corporates get internal approvals rather for shorter terms than utilities.
That's very interesting, yeah. And do you see any movements or changes on the financing sector? Because I guess we always talk about the off-taker and the developer, but that's one of the big contributing factors, what kind of risks they accept as a financier.
Well, I mean, as I said, 10-year is rather standard. There are even longer PPAs. And I think also there's such a big demand right now from financing institutions or banks. So that I don't think there's much difference like in financing costs, or it develops more and more to really reasonable conditions, even having PPAs, and the PPAs become much more financeable. So I think that will come to a level where it's really very acceptable.
Great. Thanks, Marie-Luise. And you also mentioned corporates, and of course, like decarbonizing industry will play a large role, as we've seen in basically all the net zero strategies and papers that have been published now. What I find interesting, it seems that more and more corporates are intensifying their decarbonization efforts on their own, so to speak, because they see a value of that for their larger stakeholder group, not just the shareholders, the customers, the general public, and etc. So, and in particular, with respect to sourcing low carbon energy, of course. What do you think, or what's your hypothesis? What drives this development?
Well, what we can observe, or what we are observing here at BayWa r.e., that this development is mainly driven by companies, often multinationals with a big carbon footprint. And most of them are now organized in these global initiatives like RE100 or 50 climate leaders. And what drives them is, I guess, the wish to have a diversification in their energy supply sources, also in order to protect themselves against any energy availability concerns, but also a hedge against rising electricity costs, especially when you are looking at CO2 costs in the future, by ensuring just a low and stable renewable electricity price, for instance, by concluding a PPA. But then it's, of course, also the need really to reduce their carbon footprint to fulfill, as you just said, their corporate sustainability commitments, which are pushed by rising customer, shareholder, also employee expectations to show really concrete action on climate protection. And also, for instance, if you are a supplier, today you have to have green credentials to win tenders and contracts at all. But it's also just pure increasing energy demand, I think, because if you look at, for instance, the RE100 companies alone, they are expected to have a 224 gigawatt shortfall in 2030.
Mhm.
So it's really a gap, and this has to be filled by renewables. There's nothing else.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, yeah, I'm sure you have lots of these conversations directly also with off-takers in your role. Do you see any changes in the, say, cooperation models between renewable developers and corporate off-takers that are being discussed? Do you think there will be a closer partnership that goes beyond corporate PPAs, for example?
Absolutely. And this is, I mean, the main reason why we have created this new segment, energy solutions, with a clear focus on corporates. We see a clear and increasing demand of corporates for a comprehensive energy consulting and for really integrated energy solutions, be it on-site where they produce or off-site, like, for instance, mobility charging stations, or peak shaving solutions for small and medium enterprises. So this is exactly what we're doing there, where we look at the corporates and try to identify what kind of integrated solutions we can offer them for them to reduce really their carbon footprint.
Very interesting. Another topic that somehow cuts across the points you mentioned is technological innovation, I would call it. So you mentioned investment innovation, hybrid models, and storage. So I mean, you could take the view solar PV, wind turbines, lithium-ion batteries are all technologies that have been around for decades. So in your view, is it all about small incremental improvements and economies of scale? Or are there any new technologies with disruptive potential on the horizon?
Personally, I believe that we will see rather evolution than revolution, to call it this way, but not necessarily with only small improvements. I think there is still really a lot of potential in the efficiency of technologies, be it generating technologies or storage technologies, and really so that we can make big steps. I think there's a huge potential in digitization. This is the whole digital integration and control of the overall energy system. And one special topic maybe is the electrolysis process, which becomes more and more important, which I believe is just, and I know that also from former Fraunhofer colleagues, that this is really a very early stage of technology where we're in, and I'm expecting big progress is really there.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and of course that's a big topic across all the conversations currently. Great. I guess there's much more that we could talk about, and I really appreciate this, sharing your long-term perspective over the next decade. But I'd also be interested to focus a bit more on Germany, and I mean we've just seen the latest version of the EEG being passed, the German Renewables Act for the listeners that are less familiar with Germany. What's your view? Will it be enough to achieve the renewables target in Germany in 2030? And maybe more important for your day-to-day work, does it address the reasons behind the slowdown in wind onshore build-out?
I think the answer to both of these questions, unfortunately, is no. First, because the target volumes with regard to the expansion of wind onshore in that case are way too low in the EEG to achieve this 65% target. And this is mainly because the underlying assumption of electricity demand in 2030 is way too low. So most scientists say we need like 740 terawatt hours gross electricity. And what they are assuming right now is less than 500. So it's a huge difference. And then, as you said, second, because the really big problems we are facing in the development of wind projects in Germany are almost not at all addressed by the EEG.
Yeah, I mean, the second one obviously being a big issue. Could you give us a practical example where a wind project hits a roadblock? So what hinders developers from building more farms in Germany?
Yeah, there are really many hurdles right now for the development of wind farms in Germany. I mean, it starts with the designation of areas for wind energy, which is by far not sufficient. And this is mainly caused by a really complete jungle of different regulations in the federal states or even within the federal state, which offer multiple possibilities to not designate areas for wind energy if you don't want to. So for all the politicians that are not in favor of wind energy, it's super easy to find a way not to do it. But it's also a result of a really, to me, unfounded political debate about distances between wind farms and residential areas, because there have been really several scientific studies about this relationship between distance and acceptance of wind farms, with the result that there is none. There is no relationship. But politicians and governments continue to maintain this position, with the effect that even municipalities that are really interested in wind energy become insecure. And people living nearby start to think, oh, wind energy must be something really bad, just by stating things that are really not proven and not true. And then assume you have managed to get this so-called planning right. This is the designation of your wind farm area after several years, because that really takes a long time. Then all of the restrictions and criteria that have been checked for this area in this designation process already will now be checked again in the permitting process, which is what we call the BIMSG Gesetz, the Federal Emission Control Act, which follows. And that takes another at least 2 years, maybe up to 5 if you get claims, which is more or less the rule. And then within this permitting process, the biggest hurdles are really nature protection and avifaunistic topics, so birds, which are dealt with in a way that is, again, neither based on scientific findings nor compliant with highest court's decisions. It's just like every authority does more or less what it wants. And this all before this background that the biggest threat really for basically all species today is climate change and not renewables or wind farms in particular. So this is really leading discussions of yesterday, and this sometimes really drives me crazy.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, it obviously affects your day-to-day work a lot. It might be not as clear for many of our listeners. So I thought that it was very valuable. Another aspect that I found interesting in the recent draft was that basically the regulator built in a continuous check to assess whether subsidies for wind and solar can be phased out over time. Do you think it's realistic to achieve our targets with merchant build-out of renewables only?
I mean, generally, I think it's, of course, okay and legitimate to say, let's check whether any subsidies are still needed in X years of time. And of course, with this new turbine generation, we really have a huge increase in energy yield. So it makes projects much more profitable with big rotors and high hub heights. The problem we have right now is rather that we have to develop a lot of projects in order to be able to build only a few. So we have to put so many projects and money in this funnel that the few that come out at the bottom need a very good tariff to compensate for all the others. And I'm afraid that if this tariff or the price you get then by a direct marketing is not enough to really compensate what you have to invest to develop these projects. Really, that's the biggest issue we have.
So very much interlinked the two topics that we just discussed.
I mean, politicians, they often just look at one project, and they say, wow, that's so profitable, because the auctions are undersubscribed, you get a good tariff right now. But this project really has to pay for 20 others that have a red kite bird, or don't get a planning right, and many other things.
Yeah. Based on what you just laid out, you seem to be of the clear view that the EEG won't solve all problems. What What would you say are the topics for the new government in the next year to address?
I think they really have to find a way to make the 16 federal states in Germany work on these topics. I mean, the federal government can only do a few things, especially in the development of renewable energy projects. So much power is with the federal states. They have now in the EEG like a coordination mechanism, something like that, between the federal government and the lender, so the federal states. But it's not clear at all how this can work and how binding this is, and what do they get targets from the top or whatever. But what has to be done is exactly these three things that I described. It's planning right, it's this whole permitting process, and it's these avifaunistic topics, which are really the killer for most of our projects. Maybe I should add here repowering, because we see that so many projects now run out of the 20-year tariff in Germany. They cannot be repowered, most of them because of this planning right situation. So if they are decommissioned, then we will not only not have an increase in capacity, but really a decrease in Germany, which is the least we need. So there have to be measures to facilitate repowering. And it's also really not understandable. I mean, you have a wind farm, birds are flying through it, everyone's happy with it. Why shouldn't you be able to replace that and by more modern turbines, less turbines, with less noise, so modern technology at the same place? And it's in half of all wind farms in Germany, it's not possible.
Yeah.
And that's crazy.
That's very insightful. And I guess it's only one part of the problem if we continuously raise targets, which we need to do. But there's much more to be done that becomes clear to just achieve what is already set out, right? I think it's a natural time to finish here. I'm very delighted to have had the opportunity to discuss this with you. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure from my side.
That was Manuel Köhler, Managing Director of Aurora's Berlin office, speaking to Marie-Luise Pörtner, Managing Director of BayWa Renewables Wind. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.